You didn't invite me here because you remembered me, Grace Miller whispered to the folded invitation resting in her hands. You invited me so everyone could watch me break. The silver seal of Ravenwood Pack caught the morning light spilling across the tiny cottage window, its elegant crest looking painfully out of place against the worn wooden table where she had spent countless evenings mending clothes for families who barely acknowledged her existence. 3 years had passed since Beta Ethan Caldwell had stood beneath the sacred moon altar and rejected her before the entire pack, calmly explaining that a weak Omega with no influential bloodline could never stand beside the future Beta of Ravenwood. The words had spread farther than the autumn wind, becoming whispers in every market, every gathering, every festival. Some pitied her. Most simply looked away. In a kingdom where strength decided status and destiny often favored the powerful, Grace had learned that silence was safer than defending herself. Yet the invitation in front of her carried something even colder than rejection. Ethan was marrying Vanessa Hart, the ambitious daughter of the neighboring Alpha family, and he wanted Grace there to witness every smiling face, every blessing, every promise that should have belonged to someone else. The elegant handwriting requested the honor of her presence, but every line felt sharpened with quiet cruelty. She could already imagine the careful glances, the whispered laughter, the polite smiles hiding satisfaction that the forgotten Omega had returned exactly where everyone expected her to remain, at the edge of the room, unnoticed except when serving as a reminder of failure. Grace folded the invitation with steady fingers despite the ache pressing against her chest. She had promised herself long ago that humiliation would never steal the last thing she still possessed. Her dignity might be invisible to everyone else, but it belonged to her alone. Outside, the crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and approaching winter. The towers of Ravenwood Castle rose above the distant forest, their dark stone walls glowing beneath a pale morning sky. Tomorrow night those halls would shine with music, crystal chandeliers, and the laughter of nobles arriving from every allied pack across the Northern Territories. Every important family would gather beneath the full moon to celebrate Ethan Caldwell's rise. Every important family except hers. Grace reached for the simple white cloak hanging beside the door, brushing away a loose thread with gentle care. It was old but spotless, stitched by her own hands after countless evenings spent earning a living through quiet work no one celebrated. She looked into the small mirror above the fireplace. Soft brown hair framed her pale face, and calm blue eyes looked back with a strength that hardship had forged instead of broken. She was not the dazzling beauty the songs admired. She was not born into wealth or power. She was simply a woman who had survived disappointment without allowing bitterness to poison her heart. Somewhere beyond the endless line of snow-covered pines, fate was already moving toward her with silent footsteps, carrying a meeting neither kings nor elders could have predicted. By the time the next moon reached its highest point above Ravenwood, the invitation meant to shame an unwanted Omega would become the spark that changed the destiny of an entire kingdom. The road to Ravenwood wound through towering pines whose branches carried the first dusting of winter, and Grace Miller walked alone with measured steps, the invitation tucked safely inside her cloak as though hiding it could somehow lessen its weight. Travelers passed her every so often, dressed in fine wool coats and polished boots as they made their way toward the celebration that everyone across the Northern Territories had been discussing for weeks. Excited conversations drifted through the crisp air. They spoke about Ethan Caldwell's future, Vanessa Hart's beauty, and the powerful families expected to gather beneath the full moon. No one noticed the quiet Omega walking along the edge of the road, and Grace preferred it that way. She had spent years becoming invisible. It was a skill that required no talent, only enough disappointment. As the afternoon sun slipped behind thick gray clouds, the forest grew strangely still. Even the birds seemed to pause, leaving only the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the ancient trees. Grace slowed when she noticed fresh hoof prints cutting away from the main road toward a narrow trail she had never taken before. Moments later, a frightened horse emerged from between the pines without a rider, its reins dragging across the frozen ground. The beautiful black stallion trembled, its breathing uneven, as though it had escaped something unexpected. Grace raised her hands carefully, and spoke in the calm voice she had always used when comforting frightened animals. The horse hesitated only for a moment before lowering its head, allowing her to stroke its neck. It was then that she heard the sound. Not a cry for help, not a shout, but the faint crack of a branch somewhere deeper within the woods. Guided by instinct rather than curiosity, she followed the sound through snow-covered undergrowth until she reached a small clearing where a man rested against the base of an ancient oak. His dark traveling cloak was dusted with snow, and although he carried himself with remarkable composure, exhaustion showed in the slow rhythm of his breathing. His face remained partly hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, yet there was something undeniably commanding about him, even seated upon the cold forest floor. Grace stopped several feet away, uncertain whether to approach or leave quietly. Before she could decide, the stranger lifted his head. Brilliant silver eyes met hers with calm awareness, neither fearful nor demanding. They simply watched her as though measuring the truth inside her heart rather than the appearance she presented to the world. "Your horse found me before I found you," Grace said softly, keeping her distance so he would not feel threatened. The stranger glanced toward the trail where the stallion now waited peacefully behind her. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I suppose fortune still remembers my name," he replied. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without ever raising it. Grace noticed the strain hidden beneath that calm tone, and the weariness he seemed determined not to reveal. "You should not remain out here after sunset," she said gently. "The temperature will fall below freezing before long." The stranger studied her for another silent moment, almost surprised that she had offered concern before asking questions. Grace removed the small flask of warm herbal tea from her satchel and extended it toward him with both hands. "It is not much," she admitted with a shy smile, "but it will help until you reach shelter." For the first time in many years, destiny quietly shifted beneath the winter sky, and neither of them realized that this simple act of kindness had already begun changing the course of every promise waiting inside Ravenwood Castle. The stranger accepted the small flask with unexpected care, as though it were something far more valuable than warm tea. His gloved fingers brushed the worn leather cover before he lifted it slowly. Steam drifted into the cold evening air, carrying the gentle scent of mint and mountain herbs. After one quiet sip, he closed his eyes for the briefest moment, allowing the warmth to settle against the chill that had followed him through the forest. "Thank you," he said, returning the flask without hesitation. Most people would have walked away. Grace smiled faintly as she tucked it back into her satchel. Most people probably have somewhere more important to be. The stranger studied her expression carefully. "And you do not." She glanced toward the distant castle towers barely visible through the trees. Golden lights had already begun to appear against the darkening sky, glowing like scattered stars above Ravenwood. "I do," she admitted. "I simply cannot imagine anyone waiting for me." Something unreadable flickered across the stranger's face before disappearing behind the calm discipline he carried so naturally. He rose to his feet with controlled movements, noticeably stronger than she had first assumed despite the exhaustion lingering in his eyes. Standing now, he seemed even taller, his quiet presence filling the clearing without effort. Grace found herself taking a respectful step backward, not out of fear, but because something about him reminded her of the old stories elders told beside winter fires. Stories about leaders whose strength never needed to be announced because everyone could feel it the moment they entered a room. The black stallion walked directly toward him and lowered its head with unmistakable affection. Grace noticed the unusual behavior immediately. Horses did not trust strangers so completely. "He seems very loyal," she observed. The man rested a hand along the animal's neck. "He has carried me through many difficult roads." Grace nodded softly. "Then he chose well when he came looking for help." The stranger looked at her again, and this time there was unmistakable curiosity in his silver eyes. "You helped without asking my name." Grace answered with the honesty that had always guided her life. "Names tell me who someone is called. Kindness tells me who they are." The forest grew silent once more. Even the wind seemed to pause between the towering pines as though the ancient woods themselves wished to remember her words. Far beyond the trees, church bells echoed from Ravenwood, announcing that guests were beginning to arrive for tomorrow's ceremony. Grace inhaled slowly, reminding herself that she still had miles to walk before reaching the village where she planned to spend the night. She adjusted her cloak and offered the stranger a small, respectful bow. "I should continue before it becomes too dark." Before she could turn away, his voice stopped her. "Will you attend the gathering at Ravenwood Castle?" Grace hesitated before answering. "Yes." She forced a gentle smile that barely reached her eyes. "I received an invitation." He noticed the sadness hidden beneath her composed expression, but did not press further. Instead, he removed an elegant silver clasp from the edge of his traveling cloak. It bore the shape of a moon surrounded by finely crafted wolves, though no royal crest was visible. "Keep this," he said. Grace immediately shook her head. "I cannot accept something so beautiful." "Then consider it a promise," he replied quietly. "If tomorrow becomes more difficult than you expect, show this to any royal guard you meet." She stared at the small silver emblem, resting in his open palm. "Royal guard?" she repeated, confused. A faint smile returned to his face. Sometimes the safest path appears only after someone is willing to trust a stranger. Grace accepted the clasp with reluctant gratitude, never realizing that she now carried a symbol recognized throughout the Northern Territories, one that only a handful of people in the kingdom possessed, and none of them had ever been ordinary travelers. Grace slipped the silver clasp into the inner pocket of her cloak, thanking the stranger once more before continuing down the narrow forest path. She glanced back only once. The man had already mounted his magnificent black stallion, his dark silhouette almost disappearing among the ancient pines as twilight settled over the mountains. There was something unforgettable about the quiet confidence he carried, yet she reminded herself that their meeting had been nothing more than an unexpected act of kindness between two travelers whose paths would likely never cross again. By the time she reached the small village beneath Ravenwood Castle, lanterns glowed warmly from every window. Inns overflowed with guests from neighboring packs. Merchants displayed elegant fabrics and silver jewelry along crowded streets, and musicians filled the evening air with cheerful melodies celebrating tomorrow's ceremony. Everywhere Grace looked, banners bearing the Ravenwood crest fluttered above the stone roads. Excitement surrounded her like a tide she could never quite join. She rented the smallest room available at a modest inn near the edge of town and quietly thanked the elderly innkeeper who offered her a simple bowl of vegetable stew and fresh bread. The woman smiled kindly, unaware of the burden hidden behind Grace's calm expression. Later that evening, Grace carefully laid her white dress across the narrow bed. It was plain compared with the gowns that noble families would wear inside the castle, but every stitch reflected patience, determination, and pride. She had sewn it herself over many months, choosing simplicity instead of trying to imitate wealth she did not possess. As she smoothed the fabric with gentle hands, a faint knock interrupted the silence. The innkeeper stood outside, holding a small package wrapped in dark blue cloth. "A messenger delivered this a few minutes ago," she said with a curious smile. He insisted it belonged to the young lady in the white cloak. Confused, Grace accepted the parcel and thanked her before closing the door. She slowly untied the ribbons surrounding the cloth. Inside rested a pair of elegant silver shoes, beautifully crafted but surprisingly comfortable when she slipped them onto her feet. Beneath them lay a neatly folded note written in graceful handwriting. It contained only a single sentence: "Walk with confidence. The moon never forgets those who remain kind." There was no signature. Grace read the words several times, wondering whether the stranger from the forest had somehow arranged the mysterious gift. The thought seemed impossible, yet she could not explain the quiet warmth filling her heart. For the first time since receiving Ethan's invitation, the fear that had followed her began to loosen its grip. She stood before the small mirror hanging beside the bed, wearing the simple white dress and the unexpected silver shoes. The woman reflected in the glass was still the same Grace Miller who had endured years of rejection, but something within her gaze had changed. Hope, fragile but unmistakable, now rested where only sadness had lived before. Beyond her window, the towers of Ravenwood Castle shimmered beneath the rising full moon, while noble guests continued arriving in elegant carriages that lined the long stone road leading toward the royal gates. None of them realized that somewhere among the countless visitors was the forgotten Omega whose presence had been carefully arranged to entertain a crowd. None of them knew that before sunrise, preparations far greater than Ethan Caldwell's ceremony were quietly unfolding inside the royal residence, where the highest-ranking guards had suddenly received an unexpected order from a ruler whose identity Grace had not yet discovered. Every entrance was to remain open. Every commander was to stand ready. And when a young woman wearing a simple white dress arrived at the castle, she was to be welcomed with the highest respect, no matter who questioned the command. Morning arrived beneath a crystal blue sky, and Ravenwood Castle stood proudly above the valley as though it had been carved from the mountain itself. Long banners swayed from its ancient towers while guests dressed in elegant coats and shimmering gowns crossed the wide stone bridge leading toward the grand entrance. Grace Miller paused at the foot of the castle steps, quietly steadying her breath before joining the line of arriving visitors. She reminded herself that she had survived far more difficult days than this one. Whatever waited beyond those towering doors would eventually become another memory. The royal guards stood perfectly still in polished black armor, their silver cloaks moving gently in the mountain breeze. Grace lowered her eyes as she approached, expecting little more than a brief glance before being directed toward the back of the great hall. Instead, one of the guards noticed the small silver clasp fastened inside her cloak as the fabric shifted with the wind. His expression changed instantly. He stepped forward, placed a closed fist over his heart, and bowed his head with unmistakable respect. Every nearby guard mirrored the gesture without hesitation. Guests stopped walking. Curious whispers spread through the entrance courtyard as dozens of surprised eyes turned toward the quietly dressed Omega, receiving honors usually reserved for royalty. Grace froze in confusion. "There must be some mistake," she said softly. The captain of the guard lifted his head with calm certainty. "There is no mistake, Miss Miller. We have been instructed to welcome you with the highest courtesy." Before she could ask another question, a magnificent black carriage rolled through the castle gates. Its polished surface reflected the morning sunlight, while four powerful black horses came to a graceful stop before the entrance. Every noble in the courtyard immediately stepped aside. Conversations disappeared into complete silence. The royal standard bearing the silver wolf of the Northern Crown fluttered above the carriage door. Grace watched in astonishment as the same stranger she had met within the forest stepped onto the stone courtyard. Gone were the simple traveling clothes and weathered cloak. He now wore an elegant black coat embroidered with silver thread, a ceremonial mantle resting across broad shoulders, and the unmistakable crest of the royal house fastened above his heart. His silver eyes calmly surveyed the courtyard before settling on Grace with the same gentle expression she remembered beneath the ancient oak. One by one, every alpha, beta, noble elder, and commander lowered their heads. "Your Majesty," they said together. Grace felt the world around her become strangely quiet. The traveler who had accepted her cup of herbal tea, the man whose horse had trusted her, the stranger who had spoken with kindness instead of pride, was Alpha King Adrian Blackwood himself. He crossed the courtyard without the slightest sign of haste, stopping only when he stood before her. A warm smile softened the dignity of his royal bearing. "I believe," he said gently, "that I promised you the safest path would appear when the time was right." Grace searched his face, struggling to find words. "I did not know who you were." Adrian's smile widened slightly. "That is exactly why I wished to meet you before anyone else reminded you." He extended his gloved hand with effortless grace, offering not a command but an invitation. "Miss Grace Miller, would you do me the honor of walking into Ravenwood Castle beside me?" Around them, silence settled over every stone of the courtyard. No one dared speak. No one dared interrupt. And for the first time since Ethan Caldwell had rejected her beneath the moon altar years earlier, Grace lifted her head without fear, placed her hand gently in the Alpha King's, and together they walked toward the great hall as every eye in Ravenwood followed them in stunned disbelief. The great hall of Ravenwood Castle had welcomed kings, victorious warriors, and noble bloodlines for generations, yet no one present could remember a silence as complete as the one that settled across the room when Alpha King Adrian Blackwood entered with Grace Miller at his side. Hundreds of crystal candles reflected across polished marble floors. while musicians lowered their instruments without being asked. Every conversation disappeared into stunned disbelief. Grace could feel countless eyes following every step she took, but this time those looks carried confusion instead of pity. Adrian walked beside her with calm confidence, never rushing, never allowing even a single step to place her behind him. To everyone watching, it was unmistakable. The Alpha King had chosen to enter the ceremony with the forgotten Omega as his honored companion. At the far end of the hall, Ethan Caldwell stood beneath an arch woven with white winter roses beside Vanessa Hart. Only moments earlier they had been accepting congratulations from visiting nobles, smiling as servants prepared for the formal blessing that would unite two influential families. Ethan's confident expression vanished the instant he recognized Grace. His eyes widened before shifting toward Adrian, and the color slowly drained from his face. Vanessa noticed the change and turned toward the entrance herself. She had expected to see another group of guests. Instead, she watched the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories escort the very woman she had planned to humiliate before the entire pack. Around them, whispers spread like wine through autumn leaves. That is Grace Miller. Why is the Alpha King with her? Did they arrive together? How could that be possible? Grace heard every question, yet Adrian remained completely undisturbed. His steady presence seemed to quiet the fear that had followed her since receiving Ethan's invitation. When they reached the center of the hall, the royal chamberlain stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, your seat has been prepared." Adrian glanced toward the elevated royal table before looking back at Grace. "Please prepare another chair beside mine." The chamberlain hesitated for only a heartbeat before bowing again. "Immediately, Your Majesty." Servants hurried to fulfill the unexpected order while astonished nobles exchanged bewildered glances. No guest below royal rank had ever been invited to sit beside the Alpha King's place of honor during a formal ceremony. Ethan finally forced himself to step forward. His practiced smile returned, although it no longer reached his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "your presence honors our family beyond words." Adrian acknowledged him with a polite nod. "Congratulations on today's ceremony, Beta Caldwell." Ethan swallowed carefully before allowing his gaze to drift toward Grace. "I was surprised to see Miss Miller arrive with such distinguished company." Grace lowered her eyes, uncertain whether to answer, but Adrian spoke first. "So was I," he replied with quiet composure. It is remarkable how often genuine character remains unnoticed until someone chooses to look beyond appearances. Several elders standing nearby exchanged thoughtful glances. The simple statement carried no accusation, yet its meaning settled heavily across the gathering. Vanessa stepped forward gracefully, her jeweled gown shimmering beneath the candlelight. She offered Grace a polished smile that barely concealed her discomfort. "Grace, you look different today." Grace answered with gentle sincerity. "Thank you, Vanessa." The kindness in her voice left Vanessa strangely unsettled because it contained neither resentment nor triumph. It was simply honest. Adrian noticed the exchange without interruption, quietly observing each face surrounding them. He had spent years reading people more accurately than words ever could, and in that single moment, he understood exactly who possessed genuine dignity and who had mistaken status for greatness. The ceremony continued, but the joyful atmosphere everyone had expected had quietly transformed into careful observation. Every noble seemed more interested in the young Omega seated beside the Alpha King than in the ceremonial decorations surrounding the hall. Grace remained composed, answering only when spoken to, thanking every servant who brought refreshments, and offering the same gentle smile whether she addressed a duke, a guard, or a maid. Adrian noticed every small gesture. She treated rank as though it mattered less than character, and in a kingdom where power often decided courtesy, that quiet habit was rarer than gold. Ethan struggled to focus on the blessings being recited before the ceremonial altar. His thoughts returned again and again to Grace. She was supposed to arrive alone, uncertain, and embarrassed. Instead, every important guest now glanced toward her with growing curiosity and respect. Even visiting alphas who had ignored her existence for years now wondered who she truly was if the Alpha King himself had chosen her company. Vanessa sensed Ethan's distraction immediately. She leaned closer and whispered with a pleasant smile that concealed growing frustration. "Why does your Majesty seem so interested in her?" Ethan forced a quiet answer. "I do not know." Yet the uncertainty inside him became heavier with every passing minute. He remembered the day he had rejected Grace beneath the moon altar. At the time, he had believed he was making the practical decision expected of a future beta. Influence, alliances, and powerful bloodlines had seemed more important than quiet kindness. Looking across the hall now, he wondered whether he had mistaken value for appearance. The master of ceremonies invited distinguished guests to greet the royal table before the blessing began. One by one, nobles approached Adrian, offering respectful bows and formal words. To everyone's surprise, many also greeted Grace with equal courtesy after seeing the Alpha King acknowledge her as though her presence naturally belonged beside him. Grace accepted each greeting with humble grace, never pretending to be someone she was not. She thanked elderly ladies for their kindness, complimented young attendants on the beautiful floral arrangements, and even remembered the name of a servant she had briefly met outside the castle earlier that morning. Those simple moments slowly changed the room. People who had expected arrogance beside the throne instead discovered warmth. An elderly duchess finally smiled at Adrian and said, "Your Majesty, the young lady beside you has reminded many of us that true nobility is often revealed by kindness before titles." Adrian's silver eyes rested on Grace for a quiet moment before he answered, "That observation is wiser than you realize." Across the hall, Vanessa could no longer hide her irritation. She approached Grace carrying 2 sparkling glasses of fruit cider. "It has been years," she said sweetly. "Perhaps we should leave the past behind." Grace accepted one glass with genuine appreciation. "I would like that very much." Vanessa hesitated, clearly expecting resentment rather than forgiveness. Before she could continue, Adrian calmly rose from his chair. Every conversation immediately faded. He looked first toward Ethan, then toward the gathered nobles filling the hall. "There is something I have observed since arriving in Ravenwood," he said in an even voice. "Many judge another person's worth before ever learning the measure of their heart. That habit has weakened more kingdoms than any winter or famine." Silence settled over the hall once again. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa's confident smile disappeared completely. Grace looked toward Adrian with quiet surprise, never imagining that the kindness she had offered a weary traveler in the forest would inspire the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories to challenge an entire room filled with nobles without raising his voice even once. The hall remained silent long after Adrian's words faded into the vaulted ceiling. It was not the uncomfortable silence of fear, but the thoughtful silence that followed a truth too obvious to ignore. Grace lowered her eyes, wishing the attention would drift elsewhere, yet she could feel the atmosphere around her changing with every passing moment. People who had once overlooked her now looked again, not because her appearance had changed, but because the Alpha King had revealed what they themselves had failed to see. Ethan finally stepped away from the ceremonial altar and approached the royal table with careful composure. Every movement reflected years of noble training, yet the uncertainty in his expression could not be hidden. He stopped several feet from Adrian before bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," he began, "if I have unknowingly caused offense to a guest under your protection, I sincerely regret it." Ceremony years earlier, his voice carried neither pride nor superiority. "Grace, I believed I was making the right decision for my future. Today I realize I never truly understood your worth." Grace looked at him quietly. The old pain returned for only a heartbeat before fading beneath something stronger. "Peace," she answered with gentle honesty. "You made the choice you believed was best. I have spent the years since making mine." Her words contained no bitterness, and somehow that kindness weighed even heavier than anger could have. Vanessa stood only a few steps away, struggling to understand how everything had slipped beyond her control. The celebration she had imagined had become something entirely different. She forced a polite smile and addressed Grace once more. "You have certainly surprised everyone today." Grace smiled softly. "Life often surprises us when we least expect it." Before Vanessa could respond, the elderly high elder responsible for royal ceremonies stepped forward carrying an ancient silver staff engraved with moon symbols. His weathered eyes rested upon Adrian before addressing the assembled guests. According to the oldest traditions of the Northern Territories, any individual personally escorted into a royal gathering by the Alpha King shall be recognized as a guest under the direct honor and protection of the crown. Murmurs swept across the hall. The tradition was centuries old, rarely invoked, and almost never witnessed in modern times. The High Elder continued, "From this moment forward, Miss Grace Miller shall be treated with the respect afforded to every honored guest of His Majesty." Adrian rose from his chair with quiet dignity. Without a single dramatic gesture, he removed the elegant black royal cloak resting across his shoulders and placed it gently around Grace's shoulders instead. The rich fabric settled lightly against her white dress, its silver embroidery shimmering beneath the candlelight. Grace looked up in surprise. "Your Majesty, this belongs to you." Adrian smiled warmly. "Today it belongs exactly where it should." No one spoke. No one questioned the gesture. The meaning was unmistakable. The cloak did not announce ownership. It announced protection, trust, and public honor before every noble family gathered inside Ravenwood Castle. Ethan lowered his head, finally understanding that the woman he had once dismissed had not become valuable because a king stood beside her. She had always possessed that value. Adrian had simply been the first person powerful enough to make the entire kingdom stop long enough to notice it. Grace stood quietly beneath the weight of the royal cloak, its warmth resting gently across her shoulders as though it had been waiting for her all along. The magnificent hall that had once promised embarrassment had become a place where truth quietly revealed itself instead. No applause broke the silence. None was needed. The expressions on the faces surrounding her told a far greater story than words ever could. Noble elders regarded her with thoughtful respect. Young attendants smiled with quiet admiration. Even servants standing along the walls seemed to stand a little taller, reminded that kindness could still be recognized in a world that often celebrated power above compassion. Ethan remained motionless for several long moments before taking one final step toward Grace. His voice was calm, stripped of every trace of pride that had once defined him. "I spent years believing strength was measured by influence, position, and the family standing beside you. Today I finally understand that I was measuring the wrong things." Grace met his eyes without anger. The hurt he had caused had shaped her life, but it no longer ruled her heart. "We all choose what kind of people we become," she answered softly. "Sometimes the hardest lessons become the ones that teach us the most." Ethan lowered his head with quiet acceptance. There was nothing left to defend and nothing left to reclaim. The future he had imagined could never be rebuilt by reopening a door he had willingly closed. Vanessa also stepped forward, her confident expression replaced by sincere humility. "Grace," she said gently, "I believed standing beside important people made someone important. I was wrong. I am sorry." Grace offered the same forgiving smile she had given everyone throughout the day. "Then let today become a better beginning for all of us." The High Elder lifted his silver staff once more and addressed the gathering. "Let this day be remembered not only as the joining of two respected families, but as a reminder that honor does not belong exclusively to those born into privilege. True honor is revealed by the choices made when no reward is expected." His words echoed through the ancient chamber while countless guests reflected upon their own judgments. Adrian turned toward Grace, his silver eyes carrying the same quiet warmth she had first seen beneath the old oak tree. "When we met in the forest," he said softly, "you offered kindness before you knew my name. You expected nothing in return. That is a rare gift." Grace smiled gently. "You accepted it as though it were something valuable." Adrian returned the smile. "Because it was." Together they walked onto the castle balcony overlooking the snow-covered valley. Below them, the lights of Ravenwood shimmered beneath the rising full moon while peaceful winter winds moved across the endless pine forest where their paths had first crossed. Grace looked toward the quiet mountains stretching across the horizon and realized she no longer felt defined by the rejection that had once seemed impossible to survive. It had not been the end of her story. It had simply been the road leading her somewhere far greater than she could have imagined. Beside her, Adrian remained silent, understanding that some moments needed no promises spoken aloud. Hope itself was enough. And throughout the Northern Territories, the story that people carried home was not about a ceremony or a royal cloak. It was about a forgotten Omega who never allowed cruelty to change her gentle heart, and about a king wise enough to recognize that true greatness is never determined by status, but by the quiet courage to treat every soul with dignity before the world decides they deserve it.